guys, my name is Dahlia. This is Novel Idea. I want to make a video today talking about some of the books that I really loved in high school. High school was a time for me that really kind of cemented my interest in reading, and it also shaped the trajectory of the sorts of books I was interested in and the kinds of books I would continue to gravitate towards. I think for the most part, if I were to reread these ones, I believe I would still really enjoy them because they do stand out in my memory as being just really wonderful and really quite well written, really quality books. I would love to know if you guys have some books that you would suggest from that time in your life, and which books really kind of ignited your interest and your passion in reading. So yeah, when I was in high school, funnily enough, I did not read much YA at all. I kind of just started reading adult literary fiction as I entered grade 9, so I was like 13, 14, I think. And yeah, that's just been what I've been reading. I know that when I was ending elementary school, I read like all of the Shopaholics novels by Sophie Kinsella because I just loved them. But I was quite young at the time. That was a fun time. So I'm gonna give a couple honorable mentions to novels that I remember really enjoying, but they don't stand out to me as being like the best books I read during this time period. One I remember really enjoying was The Outcast by Sadie Jones. I don't remember much about this book other than it taking place, I believe, during World War II or World War I. Can't exactly remember, but it follows I think a young boy. I want to say his name is Lewis. Like I said, it's been ages. But I remember feeling that this novel really captured a sense of loneliness and feeling that it did that, very well. So I recall really enjoying this book, but I have yet to read anything else by this author. Another novel that I remember really enjoying is Audrey, not going to try her last name, but it's The Time Traveler's Wife. So I think this book, as I recall, was a little bit tough to get into, but once I was into it, it was really immersive. And I remember thinking it was like incredibly sad, but I love when books can get to that emotional place for me. So this was another novel that I think I really responded quite well to it at the time. One more book I'm going to mention as an honorable mention, and this is kind of out of left field for me. I don't really read stuff like this, but the book I have to mention is called The Gargoyle by Andrew Davidson. I read this book while I was on a trip to British Columbia with my dad and my stepbrother, and I just remember my brother being so irritated because he wanted to go and do all these things, and all I wanted to do was read this book. And it was really trippy. I think like this guy would, kind of transport to different time periods in the world, and he had this really bizarre sickness that I don't know if it enabled him to do so, but I just remember being so immersed and not being able to put this book down for the life of me. Now, to get into the books I remember absolutely loving in high school, the first book I'm going to talk about is All of Carriage by Elizabeth Strout. This novel, I love it, and I think it's since been adapted into a TV series with Frances McDormand. But this novel sort of centers around the character of Olive Kitteridge. It takes place in this in this town on the coast of Maine, and it's kind of this like quintessential New England town. And Olive, she is a teacher and she's married to her husband, who is a pharmacist. It really gets into what I think are a lot of the subtler moments, but ones that are also really sort of meaningful and indicative of life at large in this sort of small community. I read a review where someone mentioned that it's sort of like a novel in stories. The novel takes on a number of different perspectives. It kind of jumps through different narrations, but it is a novel. It's not a collection of short stories. They all sort of peripherally do involve Olive. Olive is described and seen as others as being this really unsavory, sort of rude and, just not likable person. As the reader, you become a lot more intimately acquainted with Olive and with her sort of internal life, and you realize that what comes off as being a little bit unapproachable and maybe a bit harsh or rude is in fact kind of an inability to communicate her actual genuine concern and empathy for other people. Olive is a really empathic person. She's really quite feeling, but she's not very good at communicating her feelings. And I think that that's just a very relatable personality trait. How small town life can be sort of suffocating. People in them are they're realistic people, they're flawed and they're complicated, but they also are deeply feeling people and they're sensitive. So I just thought that this was such a great character study of Olive in particular. It gets into, I think, some really interesting themes that I enjoy reading about, like family dynamics in small town life, and also I remember it tackling the subject of grief. You definitely got a sense of place and location. This is a book, that I really enjoyed during high school. The next book I want to mention is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. This won the Pulitzer in 2008, and I believe that Olive Kitteridge won the Pulitzer for 2009. I'm just gonna flag this. I'm not gonna discuss it at any length, but I am aware that Junot Diaz has since been under a lot of scrutiny, and there have been some allegations that were pressed against him. I will leave some info about that in the info bar, but I'm not going to get into that. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Well, wow, at a very basic surface level, it is a coming-of-age story, but I also think that to describe it just as a coming-of-age story would be to really describe it at its thinnest layer, and it really minimizes what this book is about. Let's follow the character of Oscar, who his background is from Dominican Republic, but he's currently living in the States, and he's described as being this very overweight, insecure teenager who's like really interested in comic books and science fiction and video games, and has a very difficult time connecting with women. There's his somewhat of a foil character in Junior, who conversely to Oscar is quite good with women, and he is very masculine and interested in very manly things, and he kind of embodies this kind of masculinity that Oscar really wants to achieve for himself. It really gets into kind of this hyper masculinity that exists in the Dominican Republic, and how that really comes to impact Oscar and his view of himself and his own abilities to kind of accept himself and the way that he is. I found that it really did kind of challenge that view on masculinity, because Oscar, while he doesn't embody some of those typical, masculine traits, he does at the same time embody masculine traits, but just those traits that aren't necessarily as obvious or as associated with masculinity. So for example, the ability to be vulnerable, that definitely takes a kind of strength. And being honest and being loyal, those are all very masculine or even genderless, admirable traits that Oscar possesses, but he doesn't really see them as being masculine. So it really challenges this concept of masculinity and what we understand to be masculine, and how there are different traits that do in fact embody strength and resilience, but maybe are not viewed at large as being these masculine character traits. There's also a lot of political involvement and discussion in the novel. Specifically, it talks a lot about the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo. He was essentially this brutal dictator. I really delved into what Dominican Republic was like under his dictatorship. Another thing the novel does is it does have this intergenerational component to it, where it gets into the life of Oscar's mother when she was growing up in the Dominican and how she was orphaned at a young age. That sort of intertwined, as well as this sort of magical realist element to it, where there is this curse that seems to be, plagued upon this family, and there's also like a counter curse that corresponds with it. There's a lot going on I think, in this book on an individual level, what it means for him to align with his lineage and with his coming from, Dominican Republic, and what it means to be a man, and also just the broader, more political element more broadly. So this novel takes on a lot. It's very ambitious, but I thought it did it so well, and it's such an immersive and really enjoyable read. There's a lot of extensive footnotes, and Junot Diaz does throw in a lot of Spanish, but it didn't take away from my understanding or enjoyment of the novel at large. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. The book I want to talk about is I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb. This book I read in grade 9, and it just got me into reading. It was very pivotal for me. It is a really big book. I think what Lamb is incredibly good at doing is getting into mental illnesses and sort of describing and explaining the trajectory and how these mental illnesses come into being. And in the novel, he specifically deals with schizophrenia. Follows the two characters, Dominic and Thomas, who are identical twin brothers. And Dominic is the narrator. It has these flashbacks between present day and their past, and how their past, with some of the abuse that they experienced and the domestic violence that occurred in their household at a young age, and in particular how that affected Thomas a lot more than Dominic, because Dominic was kind of this shy and gentle character, whereas Dominic was a little bit more, less timid. Thomas was really impacted by the abuse that took place, and how that kind of shaped his formative years in ways that later impacted him and presumably contributed to his development of schizophrenia. The novel begins with this very dramatic scene where Thomas is at a public library and he is about to cut off his hand. He believes that he speaks with God and that God is informing him that he needs to do this. His brother is incredibly dependent on him, and how Dominic feels very much that he is required and obligated to look out for his brother, but also how that impedes on his own personal life. His own personal life is also very tumultuous because he has unstable relationship and a previous relationship that fell apart. There is also this one incredibly long section of the novel where they read their grandfather's diary. That part was a bit of a doozy for me. It went on for far too long, in my opinion, but ultimately I think it did have some larger meaning on the overall message of the novel, so I powered through that. I remember feeling when it ended just how sad I was that it was over, and I immediately went out and bought Wally Lamb's other book, which is She's Come Undone. And that book is also really wonderful, and again tackles mental illness and how our younger years really kind of, again, shape issues that we face later on in our adult lives, showing how our kind of preparatory younger years are really pivotal in terms of our ability to cope with trauma later in life. I loved these two books. I thought they were both great. Later in high school, I did read The Hour I First Believed, and it's also very long, and this one I did not enjoy nearly as much. So I wouldn't recommend that one, but his other two books I just loved. Anyway, those are the books that I just quickly want to mention. There are a number of other books that I read in high school that I really loved, and I might do another follow-up to this video, just talking a little bit more about some of those other books. Those are all books that have kind of stuck with me, and I think back on them, every now and again. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please do subscribe if you enjoy the content, and if you don't, maybe you should subscribe because maybe eventually you will enjoy the content. Would love to hear some comments down below, and I will catch you next time.